Take your Bibles, turn to Joshua chapter 18, if you would. Last week, Pastor Jim taught from Joshua 13 and 14, which was primarily about the allocation and the inheritance of the land that was given to Caleb. The couple of chapters in between, chapters 15, 16, and 17, talk about the allocation of the land and of the territory for three of the tribes, for Judah, for Ephraim, and for Manasseh, half the tribe of Manasseh. One of the things that Pastor Jim has been talking about over the last month or so or more is the fact of the promise that God gave to the Israelites where he was going to give them the land. And it became and is still today a very important point for the Jews. They really depend upon the land. They are tied to the land. And whenever they had to go away from the land for whatever reason, it really was a point of concern for them, as was demonstrated during their time in Egypt, as demonstrated by the time in Babylon. And every time they came back, they restored that relationship with the land that they had and that God provided for them. While they were headed toward the promised land, Moses allocated or gave the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh land in Transjordan. If you don't know, Transjordan is the area east of the Jordan River. So that's where those 2.5 tribes received their inheritance of the land. The other tribes received theirs west of the Jordan, in what we properly refer to as Palestine. And these chapters, from chapter 13 through most of the rest of Joshua, through I think it's around chapter 21 or so, they give the allocation of the land to the various tribes. These first three tribes in chapters 15, 16, 17, they were allocated and given without much survey of the land or anything else. They just picked up a spot of the land and they went and inherited that and started possessing it, driving out folks if they needed to, and just dealing with all the aspects of occupying the land. But when we get to chapter 18, there's a problem that came up. That problem was that there were still 7 tribes that had not received their inheritance and their allocation of land, so that they go in and possess that land. And that's what chapter 18 and 19 are about, is the allocation of the land, the remaining parts of the land, to the remaining 7 tribes. And Joshua thought that it was so important that they continue the allocation of the land that he called everyone together, and they had an assembly. And he told them what they were going to do to continue the allocation of the land. And that's where we begin in chapter 18, verse 1. I'm going to read chapters 18, verses 1 through 10. It says, "Then the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled themselves at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, and the land was subdued before them. There remained among the sons of Israel 7 tribes who had not divided their inheritance. So Joshua said to the sons of Israel, 'How long will you put off entering to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you? Provide for yourselves 3 men from each tribe, that I may send them, and that they may arise and walk through the land and write a description of it according to their inheritance. Then they shall return to me. They shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall stay in its territory on the south. The house of Joseph shall stay in their territory on the north. You shall describe the land in 7 divisions and bring the description here to me. I will cast lots for you here before the Lord our God. For the Levites have no portion among you, because the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh also have received their inheritance eastward beyond the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them. Then the men arose and went, and Joshua commanded those who went to describe the land, saying, Go and walk through the land and describe it, and return to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh. So the men went and passed through the land and described it by cities in 7 divisions in a book. And they came to Joshua to the camp at Shiloh. And Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord, and there Joshua divided the land to the sons of Israel according to their divisions. So this particular passage tells us what happened and how they allocated those remaining 7 tribes, the land that they were to inherit. It starts out in verse 1 by talking about the whole congregation coming together, and it says that they assembled themselves at Shiloh. It doesn't look this important right there, but that's a very important statement, because up until this point, since the time that the people of Israel had crossed the Jordan into Palestine, they had always had their assemblies, and they had always lived at Gilgal. Gilgal was about 15 miles or so southeast of Shiloh. It's the land, or it's the place across the Jordan that they came, and the place that they delivered or attacked Jericho and Ai and many of the other places. In fact, that's where they were living up to this point, was in Gilgal. But it was significant that they moved to Shiloh, because it says that they not only moved there, but they set up the tent of meeting there. That means that they set up the tabernacle that they had been carrying around for the previous 40-something years, and they set that tabernacle up, and that was the place that they had chosen, that God had chosen for them to, at least for some period of time, to be recognized as the place where he would meet them. So the tabernacle represented the presence of the Lord among the people. So saying that they had moved the tabernacle from Gilgal to Shiloh was an important step. And it says, and the land was subdued before them. So at this point, all the land had been subdued. It had been mostly taken care of. There were still pockets of the indigenous people that were still there that had to be dealt with. But for the most part, all of the land had been defeated, and or at least as much as they were going to defeat it, and had been subdued by the Israelites. So that was the situation at that point. And they still had those 7 tribes that needed to be assigned territory within the land. Verse 2 says, there remained among the sons of Israel 7 tribes who had not divided their inheritance. Since they had not divided that inheritance, what did that mean for them? They were still wanderers. What did that mean in terms of the promise that God had given them, that he would give them the land and give them a place to settle down in the land?
They had not taken the several days to go find it.
Exactly. Even though God had promised it long before, in fact, if you look back in the book of Deuteronomy, God promised that he would provide them the land, he would give them the land, and he based it upon the promises that he had made to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. But up to this point, they had only partially fulfilled that or accessed that promise from God, had not been completely fulfilled. And that's what Joshua was concerned about, because they had not completely obtained that promise from God, or fulfilled that promise from God. And so verse 3 says, "So Joshua said to the sons of Israel, 'How long will you put off entering to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?'" That statement, if you can read it a couple of different ways. One, it's just a question saying, okay, why haven't you gone and done what God told you to do to possess the land? But it could also be looked at as an accusation against the people. Why haven't you done this? God said to do it. You haven't done it yet. And so, and in fact, it almost came across as a command that Joshua was telling them that God promised, but they hadn't fulfilled their part of that promise to possess the land, and so they had still not fulfilled that promise from God. Verse 4 says, "Provide for yourselves 3 men from each tribe, that I may send them, and that they may arise and walk through the land and write a description of it according to their inheritance. Then they shall return to me." So Joshua now was giving them instructions on how to take care of possessing that land, how to divide it, how to possess it, and ultimately determine who would get which sections of land. And what follows this particular passage in verses 1 through 10, beginning in verse 11 of chapter 18, all the way through chapter 19, gives the description of that land that they came back with for each one of the tribes. But note that when Joshua first told them to go describe the land, divide it into 7 portions or 7 territories, at that point they didn't know who was going to be in which sections of the land, because that did not come until later when Joshua cast lots to determine who would go where. One of the interesting things about these descriptions of the land that is in this chapter in chapters 18 and 19, one of the really interesting parts about it is that it's very precise, it's very well laid out, and almost all the descriptions have the same type format. If you look back at chapters 15, 16, and 17, where it's talking about the other 3 tribes, those did not have that same characteristics of being well laid out and described. So it's like these particular descriptions in 18 and 19 are most likely what the 3 men, the 21 men, the 3 men from each tribe, is what they described the land. It's how they described the land. It said that they were to write that in a book. Well, actually, a book for them was a scroll, so they would write it in a scroll. Have you ever looked to see what those land descriptions look like? Okay. I want everyone who has a Bible with you. Okay? I want you to use a part of the Bible that you may use very infrequently. Okay? Anybody know where that is? The maps in the back of the Bible, usually in the back of the Bible. Most likely, you have a map similar to what I have here that gives the map of the land and the way that the 7 portions, or in this case, actually it was like 9.5 portions. When you look at all of them, how they were laid out. So you can see here how all the tribes fit together, where they had land, and you may think, well, what's the big deal about that? The big deal about that is through the rest of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, those divisions of the land and the way the tribes were assigned the land had impact upon the people and how the people developed, how they related to one another, how they worshiped. It had everything to do with just about everything that they were in terms of their relationships, their society, their culture, and their relationship with God. So sometime when you get a chance, look at the map some. I know I never did look at the maps in the back of the Bible a lot until a few years ago. Actually, it's more than just a few now. It's about 25 years ago now. And I started looking at the maps, and there's all kinds of things that you can discover about descriptions in the Bible by looking at the maps. They can be very, very helpful. Verse 5 in chapter 18 says, "They shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall stay in its territory on the south, and the house of Joseph shall stay in their territory on the north." Judah was one of the larger sections. Both Judah and Joseph were some of the more larger sections of land of the territory. And Judah's land was most of the land on the south. And if you look at a map, you won't see a tribe for Joseph. Why not? Does anybody know? Because what? Because Joseph's father claimed Joseph's 2 sons as his own. That was Ephraim and Manasseh. And so they received land portions along with the other tribes, except for one, except for Levi. The other thing you will not see on the map when you look at the division of the land, you will not see a land portion for Levi, because Levi didn't get any land. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. But Judah and Joseph had already received their land. That is, Ephraim and Manasseh had already received their land. And Manasseh is the most unique of the tribes in terms of their land inheritance, because 1/2 of the tribe of Manasseh got their land on the east side of the Jordan. The other half got their inheritance on the west side of Jordan. So they were kind of divided. Even though they were one tribe, they were divided in terms of their land. And verse 6 says, "You shall describe the land in 7 divisions and bring the description here to me, and I will cast lots for you here before the Lord our God." So Joshua was giving the people instructions on how to do what needed to be done to divide the land. And beginning in verse 8, it actually goes through and talks about them actually doing what Joshua said. Joshua, even though Joshua had been the leader of the people for many years, and it's interesting how many years that he was the leader. Don't know exactly how many there were, but he was with them in the wilderness for 40 years. We don't know exactly how old Joshua was when they left Egypt and began wandering in the wilderness, but he led them from the time they entered the promised land until he died at the age of 110. So Joshua was kind of old when he died. And did I hear some laughs over here? Verse 7 says, "For the Levites have no portion among you, because the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh also received their inheritance eastward beyond the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them." So the 2.5 tribes got their land on the east side of Jordan, but the Levites did not get any land. They did get cities. They were granted cities within the inheritances of the other tribes, but their inheritance was God. Especially the priesthood of the Lord was their inheritance, which I think Pastor Jim talked about a week or two ago. So that was the plan that Joshua gave that they were to use to determine and to allocate the land and to then go and possess the land. Verse 18 begins the description of them actually doing it. It said, "Then the men arose and went, and Joshua commanded those who went to describe the land, saying, 'Go and walk through the land and describe it and return to me. Then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh.'" One of the most interesting parts of that statement in that verse for me, and in fact it is reflected in a number of these verses up to this point, is that all that was being done here was being done before the Lord, being done in the presence of the Lord. Kind of going back to the reference that it made to the tent of meeting or to the tabernacle, because that represented God's presence among the people. So everything was being done in God's presence. And in fact, God was directing what should be done through Joshua. Verse 9 says, "So the men went and passed through the land and described it by cities in 7 divisions in a book. And they came to Joshua to the camp at Shiloh." So the 21 men walked through the land that was yet to be divided. They made descriptions of it, which, as I said, I believe the descriptions that they brought back is the rest of chapter 18 and then chapter 19 that describes the portions of land. They came back to Joshua just as he had told them to, and they came back to the camp at Shiloh. And then Joshua, verse 10 says, "And Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord. And there Joshua divided the land to the sons of Israel according to their divisions." So they cast lots. Joshua cast lots before the Lord to determine who went where in terms of the divisions. And I find it interesting that the tribes did not get to select themselves which land they would go to. These 7 tribes were not able to select that. It was assigned to them by God. Does that statement sound strange, that God assigned them the land? But
That made selfish decisions on what they wanted near the water and how the land lay.
They would definitely have made selfish decisions. We saw that, you can see that back in Genesis when Lot made very selfish decisions, which turned out not to be such great decisions. And it could have been very contentious as well. But how is it that God chose the land for each one of the tribes? Because it says that Joshua cast lots. Okay, it's the way we would understand that probably would be, just as you said, a case of chance. But they did not believe that it was chance. They believed that the casting of the lots, God controlled the lots, so God directed who would go where. So the decision of which tribes went to which pieces of land was decided by God. And that's also a very important part of this. Because, as some of you have already said, if they had decided for themselves where it was, and this, at least in this particular situation, it probably would have been very contentious. They would have been trying to make selfish decisions about which land they got, and those things just did not go well in terms of what God's plan was for them in the future. Was at the end of verse 10, when they cast the lots, had that come, I mentioned earlier that these 7 tribes had not fulfilled the promise of God in terms of accepting the land and taking the land, did that fulfill the requirement that they fulfilled God's promise of providing them land? Exactly. That also did not quite fulfill it, because they then had to go and physically possess the land, which is kind of the descriptions that was giving in the latter part of chapters 18 and 19. So notice that it was items that they had to do along with God. There were certain parts of it that God did, but there were certain parts that they had to work with God and do their part. That same thing applies to us today. Sometimes there are some things that we cannot control, we can't really do anything about. Those things we have to rely upon God to deal with those. But there are some things that God can give us the direction, and then we have to take the responsibility and the accountability to go and do those things as God has directed and instructed us to do. Any questions about that up to this point?
When they did that survey, did they go to the Euphrates River? Because that's what God promised Moses, the promised land. But I don't think they surveyed that part of the land at that time.
They did not. What was originally promised by God in a number of different places was that he would give them the land he would give them all the land that Abraham had traveled on, which included some of the land up to the Euphrates River. But initially they did not take that. They did not go that far north. Does anybody know when they went to when the promise was fulfilled to going up to the Euphrates River? No, it was done in history. Yeah. It was done by King Solomon. King Solomon expanded the kingdom all the way up to some parts of the Euphrates that fulfilled that particular part of the promise by God. Any other questions? I'm sorry, what? Why did they not go all the way up there initially? I don't know the answer to that question at the moment. At this point, I think they were more concerned about just getting the primary parts of the land up through the northern part near the Sea of Galilee and a little bit above the Sea of Galilee. That was about as far as they had gone at that point. But it was later that they went further than that, expanded the kingdom further than that. Okay. This particular episode, similar to the others that we've talked about through the book of Joshua, this particular episode is another one of those that was kind of the progressive part of God's will and God's revelation to them to go and possess the land. In fact, if you look at I think it was in Deuteronomy as well as in the beginning part of Joshua, God said that he would not, or that they would not go and overtake and possess all the land all at once. Because one, they had lots of fighting to do in terms of casting out or moving out the folks that were in the land. But they also, if they were to have gone through the land very quickly, they would then have a problem with wild animals, because they had lots of other lions and bears and other things that would reproduce and and populate very quickly. So he did it. It was done on a gradual basis over a period of years that gave them a chance to possess the land partially and then to do it more over time. And that's kind of where this particular episode that we're talking about tonight comes in. It was one of those situations where they had gone so far, they needed to kind of reorganize and get started going further with it. And it took Joshua time to get them to recognize what they needed to do and to deal with that issue and move them forward. Yes? What kind of weapons did they have? Any ideas? Do what? It was not gunpowder. That's true. Their weapons were not gunpowder. What do you think it would be? Swords, spears. Yep, bows and arrows. So those are the types of weapons that they had. What other kind of weapons were used against the people as they drove them out of the land, by the way? Stones. Stones. In fact, some of them both during this period of time and later, God took care of driving some of them out by the use of boulders and hail and other things. That is talked about in several different parts of the scriptures as well. God used those kinds of things as well. Okay. There was a number of encounters with angels during Joshua's day. Okay. Any other questions? Was that sufficient, Brad?
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking of that because you said we're talking about the wildlife. I was thinking they had weapons they would need to repair them and, you know.
Yep. Which they did. They did over time. Yep. Where did all the people go that they drove out? What was that? They killed them. Yes, that was God's command. They weren't supposed to just drive the people out to another land. They were supposed to go in and kill all of the people that were there. Why were they supposed to do that? It was judgment for one on the people that were there to wipe them out. And then the other thing was to prevent the Israelites from being influenced by those religions of the people that were there. How did that turn out? Not too good. And notice that it turned out not too good because the Israelites did not wipe out the people as God had instructed them to. And how long did they have to deal with those other religions? Still do today. I'm sorry, what? Who has the Gaza Strip? Today, you mean? To be honest with you, at the moment, the lines over there keep changing so much, I'm not sure. I do not know at the moment. Now, the politics in the Middle East right now is not something that's easy, at least for me, to keep up with. So I don't even want to try to answer any of those things right now. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Any other questions about the scripture that we've got here? Okay, the major point that I wanted to make about this was the fact that once again the Israelites had not done everything that God had commanded them to do. And Joshua stepped in and gave them instructions for how to do the next set of stuff that they needed to do to be in compliance with what God had told them to do. And that's what this passage is about. Does God continue to do that through the Old Testament? And the New Testament? And today? Yes, exactly. He continues to work in that respect today as well.